The snow had stopped, but the silence it left behind was heavier than any battle cry. Across the frozen fields of Europe, the remnants of the 101st Airborne waited, not for orders, not for victory, but for the next moment to pass. Smoke still drifted from the tree line, twisting like ghosts above the ruins. The world around them looked hollow, as if even the earth itself had grown tired of war. They had survived Bastogne, though no one could quite explain how. Some said it was courage, others whispered it was chance. But deep down, every man knew it was something darker, an instinct older than fear, the will that refuses to die even when everything human inside you already has. Miller walked along the ridge, his boots crunching on shattered ice. He could still hear the echo of artillery, not outside but inside his head, a rhythm that wouldn't stop. Every sound reminded him of that night, the screams, the smoke, the smell of blood that mixed with gunpowder until you couldn't tell one from the other. And in those moments of silence, when the war around him paused, the war inside him grew louder. The men talked less now. Words felt expensive. What could they say that hadn't already been burned away by the last shell, the last bullet, the last body carried out of the woods? They communicated through looks, small gestures, half smiles, a shared cigarette passed between trembling hands. These were the languages that kept them human when everything else pushed them toward madness. At dusk, they gathered around the wreck of an old jeep that no longer moved. The steel was cold to the touch, but it gave them a place to sit, to exist. Private Dawson pulled a letter from his pocket, folded, unreadable from the mud, but he opened it anyway, pretending he could still make out the words his wife had written months ago. He read it silently, mouthing each line as though speaking them would make them real again. Cole watched him for a moment before saying quietly, "You think they still believe we're coming home?" Dawson smiled without humor. "I don't know if we believe it anymore." The wind moved through the trees like a whisper. Somewhere far off, a lone shot cracked, distant but sharp. No one flinched. They just stared into the dark. The sound of death had become ordinary, like thunder before rain. Miller pulled out a small harmonica. The edges were dented, the metal tarnished. He hadn't played it since the first month of deployment. But now, with the air still and the night stretching endlessly ahead, he lifted it to his lips and played a few broken notes. The melody was simple, half-remembered, maybe something from a radio back home. It wavered in the cold, fragile as breath, and for a few seconds the war seemed far away. No one said a word. Even the wind listened. Later, as the fire burned low, Miller lay back against the dirt and looked up at the stars. They were faint through the smoke, but they were there. Tiny, unbothered lights scattered over the dying world. He wondered if his daughter could see the same sky, thousands of miles away. He imagined her asking when he'd return and his wife answering in a soft, uncertain voice. He closed his eyes. The darkness behind them felt safer than the one outside. That night he dreamt of home. The front porch, the creak of the swing, the smell of rain on the fields. He saw his wife standing by the door, her hair caught in the wind. She smiled, but it wasn't quite right. Something about her eyes was different, distant, almost afraid. And when he reached for her, she vanished like smoke. The porch, the house, the fields all gone, replaced by the distant thunder of shells. He woke with a start, clutching his rifle, heart pounding. Around him, the others were already awake. No one had slept. The world was still gray, the line between night and dawn barely visible. The fire had died. Steam rose from their breath like ghosts escaping their mouths. Cole broke the silence. "They say reinforcements are coming." "Yeah," Miller muttered. They'd been saying that for a week. No one argued. Hope had become something they carried like an empty canteen, useful to hold but nothing inside it. When the orders finally came, they were almost a relief. Movement meant distraction. Distraction meant survival. The message was simple. Advance to the river, secure the bridge, hold it until further notice. No one asked how long further notice meant. In war, time was a luxury measured only in breaths. They moved through the woods, the snow crunching beneath their boots. The air was sharp enough to cut. Miller walked at the front, scanning the horizon through tired eyes. Every tree looked like a silhouette waiting to move. The silence between footsteps was louder than the gunfire they expected. As they reached the river, they saw what was left of another unit, just uniforms scattered across the ice, rifles half buried in frost. The water below ran dark, slow, and silent. It carried no sound but the weight of what it had seen. Cole knelt beside a helmet resting on the bank. Inside it was a photograph, half frozen. A young woman smiling beside a car. Her handwriting on the back read, "Come home soon." He turned the photo over, then slipped it into his pocket. "No one should be left like this," he said. They crossed the river under fog. The air smelled of metal and smoke. Every shadow felt like an ambush, every branch like a whisper of something watching. The men said little. Their minds were busy counting heartbeats, measuring how much longer they might remain part of the living. Hours passed. The cold crept deeper, through gloves, through skin, into bone. It wasn't the kind of cold you could fight. It lived inside you, slow and patient, waiting for the moment your will ran out. By dusk, they reached the ruins of a village. What had once been homes were now jagged outlines against the fading light. The church stood half collapsed, its bell shattered on the ground. Inside, the pews were overturned, the floor covered in dust and glass. The men took shelter there. They didn't speak. They just sat in silence, listening to the distant thud of artillery miles away. The sound was faint but steady, a heartbeat of war that never stopped. Miller wandered to the altar. Someone had placed a single candle there, burned halfway down. He lit it again and watched the flame tremble. Its light flickered across the cracked walls, casting shadows that looked almost human. He whispered, "Forgive us." He didn't know who he was speaking to, God, the dead, or himself. Outside, snow began to fall again, slow and steady, covering the scars of the village like a shroud. The wind pushed through the broken doors, carrying the faint scent of smoke and something else. Hope, maybe, or just the memory of it. When morning came, the world looked softer. The snow had turned everything white, erasing the darkness for a while. But beneath that calm lay the truth. They were surrounded, cut off again. The radio was dead, supplies were low, and still they waited because that's what soldiers do. They wait. For orders, for rescue, for an end that never seems to arrive. Miller sat outside, sharpening his knife on a stone. The sound was slow, rhythmic, steady. He wasn't sure why he did it. Maybe it gave him something to control in a world where nothing made sense. Cole joined him, holding 2 tin cups of coffee so weak it was barely brown. He handed one over. "Think they'll remember us when this is over?" he asked. Miller took a sip, grimaced at the taste, and said, "Only if we die here." Cole laughed once quietly. "Guess we better make it worth remembering then." The laughter faded, replaced by the sound of wind and distant gunfire. In moments like that, when time slowed to a crawl, they thought about home, not as a place, but as an idea. Home was warmth, light, laughter. It was everything this place wasn't. And that memory, fragile as it was, kept them moving. That night, the men slept in shifts. Every hour, someone stayed awake, staring at the door of the ruined church as if expecting ghosts to walk in. The wind outside moaned like something alive. Each time it moved through the cracks in the walls, the sound carried whispers that no one wanted to interpret. Miller took the second watch. He sat by the candle he had lit earlier, now a tiny pool of wax clinging to the altar. He stared at it until his vision blurred, until the flame became a single line of trembling light. His mind drifted back to his daughter again, her laughter, the way she had once covered her ears during fireworks because the sound frightened her. He wondered what she would think if she could see what fireworks had turned into here. Cole stirred in his sleep, muttering words that made no sense. Dawson rolled over and groaned quietly. The rest were silent, bodies curled like children trying to stay warm. Miller envied their dreams, even if they were nightmares. When dawn came, it was gray and heavy. The men packed what was left of their gear and prepared to move. The sky looked swollen, full of snow that refused to fall. They walked through the ruins, boots crunching on ice and debris. Every corner seemed to hold a memory that didn't belong to them. As they approached the edge of the village, they found the remains of a farmhouse. Inside, the table was still set for dinner, plates covered in dust, cups frozen in place. A clock hung crooked on the wall. Its hand stopped at 3:17. Cole touched it lightly. "You ever think about how fast it all stopped?" Miller nodded. "1 minute you're sitting down to eat, the next..." He didn't finish. He didn't have to. They moved on. The forest beyond the village was thick, the kind of place where daylight struggled to reach the ground. Every step felt like walking deeper into another world. Halfway through the woods, they heard something, Metal clinking, faint voices in the distance. The men froze. Instinct took over. They crouched low, scanning through the trees. Through the fog, faint figures appeared, German soldiers moving cautiously, unaware they were being watched. There were only 3 of them, young, tired, just like the Americans. Dawson whispered, "Orders." Cole hesitated. "We let them pass. We're ghosts today." The group waited until the Germans disappeared into the mist. When the sound of footsteps finally faded, Cole exhaled slowly. "Strange, isn't it?" Miller said. "They're just boys, same as us." "Yeah," Cole replied. "And we'd kill them if someone told us to." The thought hung in the air, heavy and unspoken. By noon, the clouds finally broke and snow began to fall, soft, relentless, endless. It coated their helmets, their rifles, their faces, until they looked less like soldiers and more like statues carved from frost. They reached the outskirts of another town by nightfall. Smoke rose from the distance, thin curling lines that promised both danger and warmth. The men decided to risk it. As they entered the town, they found a handful of civilians huddled inside what used to be a school. A woman stepped forward, her face pale, her clothes torn. She held a child by the hand. Miller lowered his weapon. "We're Americans," he said. "You're safe now." The woman nodded, though her eyes said she didn't believe him. She led them inside. The classroom was filled with quiet people, their faces hollow with hunger. On the blackboard, chalk writing still remained, a half-finished math problem, frozen in time. The soldiers shared what food they had left, mostly canned beans and biscuits gone hard from the cold. The civilians accepted them silently. No words, just gratitude that couldn't be spoken. Later, the child approached Miller, offering him a small wooden toy, a horse missing one leg. Miller smiled faintly, took it, and placed it in his pocket. "Thank you," he said. The boy didn't answer. He just looked at him with eyes too old for his age. That night, the soldiers and the townspeople slept side by side, their exhaustion erasing the lines between uniform and civilian. When morning came, the air smelled of smoke again. The Germans had returned. The first shell hit the church. The blast shook the ground, sending glass and dust through the air. Screams filled the streets. The soldiers rushed outside, weapons drawn. Snow turned red within seconds. Cole shouted orders, but the noise swallowed his voice. Miller fired until his rifle jammed, then grabbed another from the ground. The sky rained fire. Walls collapsed like paper. He saw Dawson fall, hit by shrapnel. He tried to reach him, crawling through debris, but another explosion threw him back. His ears rang. The world became a blur of motion, flashes, smoke, blood. When it was over, the town was gone. Half the men were gone too. Miller found Cole sitting beside what was left of the school. His arm was bandaged, his face covered in soot. "Dawson?" Miller asked. Cole just shook his head. Neither spoke for a long time. The only sound was the crackle of fire consuming the ruins. As night fell, the survivors gathered what they could. No orders came, no radio signal, nothing. They were ghosts again, drifting through the wreckage. Miller took the wooden toy from his pocket and set it on a stone wall. "For him," he said softly. Cole looked at the sky. "Feels like the whole world's burning," he murmured. Miller nodded. "Maybe it has to before it can start again." They walked away from the flames, their shadows stretching behind them like memories they couldn't escape. For the next few days, the forest became their only home. They built small fires that gave more smoke than heat, rationed what little food they had left, and spoke even less than before. At night, Miller would take out the harmonica again, play the same broken tune, softer each time. Cole would stare into the fire, lost somewhere beyond the flickering light. The snow didn't stop. The war didn't stop, but somehow they kept moving. Because motion meant life, and life, even when it hurt, was something to hold on to. On the 5th day, they stumbled upon an abandoned train track. The rails stretched endlessly in both directions, vanishing into fog. They followed it east, step after step, boots clanging softly on frozen steel. After hours of walking, they found a derailed car half buried in snow. Inside were old supply crates, most broken but one still sealed. They pried it open. Inside, rations, bandages, a radio. For the first time in weeks, hope flickered. Cole managed to get the radio working. Static filled the air, then faint voices broke through, American accents. Coordinates. A promise of rescue. They looked at each other, almost afraid to believe it. Maybe we're not forgotten after all, Miller said. Cole smiled faintly. Not yet. They followed the directions the voice had given. Each mile felt like a test. Hunger gnawed at them, exhaustion blurred their vision. But the thought of rescue pulled them forward like a distant light in an endless tunnel. At last, they reached an open field. Smoke rose from the far side, American trucks, flags, soldiers. Home, at least for now. They stumbled into camp half alive. Medics rushed to them, pulling off helmets, wrapping blankets. The sound of English, laughter, radios playing swing music. It all felt unreal, too bright after the dark. Miller sat by a fire, holding a cup of hot soup. His hand shook so badly he spilled half of it, but he didn't care. Cole sat beside him, bandaged, silent. Think it's over? Cole asked. Miller looked into the fire. For us, maybe. But for the rest of the world? Not yet. The camera of memory would linger here, the flames reflecting in their tired eyes. The quiet between them louder than any explosion. Because even in safety, war leaves its echo. Days passed, though no one could tell how many. Time had stopped having meaning out there. The war might have moved on, but it left behind ghosts that didn't know how to rest. Miller sat outside the medic tent one night, the snow glowing faintly under the moonlight. He held a cigarette he hadn't lit, just rolling it between his fingers. Cole joined him, limping, his coat hanging loose. You ever think about home? Cole asked quietly. All the time, Miller said. But every time I try to picture it, I see this place instead. Cole nodded. Yeah, I close my eyes and still hear the shelling. Like my brain doesn't know how to shut it off. Neither man spoke for a long while. The silence between them was thick, heavy with everything they couldn't say. Behind them, the camp flickered with small fires and distant laughter. The kind of laughter that sounded more like an attempt to keep insanity away than joy. In the following days, they were reassigned to a new unit. One built from survivors, replacements, and men too stubborn to die. Their orders were simple. Move north, secure a crossroads, hold until relieved. They didn't ask questions anymore. They just followed the routine, eat, march, dig, fight, repeat. The road north was a scar across the land. Burned trees lined both sides, their branches reaching toward the sky like blackened fingers. Every now and then they passed wrecked vehicles, tanks frozen mid-battle, rifles half buried in ice, helmets scattered like forgotten memories. At one stop, they found a letter wedged under a cracked dashboard. It was addressed to someone named Evelyn. Miller read the first line, "If you're reading this, I didn't make it." He folded it carefully and tucked it into his pocket, next to the wooden horse. Some things deserve to be remembered. By the time they reached the crossroads, the snow had turned to sleet. Mud swallowed their boots. They dug trenches, built barricades, waited. That night, Miller was on watch again. The radio buzzed with fragments of distant chatter, coordinates, weather reports, static. The world outside their little patch of mud didn't seem real anymore. Then, in the distance, headlights appeared. At first, just one pair, then another, then a dozen. German trucks rolling slow through the fog. Contact, Miller whispered into the radio. We've got movement. The camp exploded into action. Men rushed to positions, loading rifles, checking ammo. The air was electric with fear and adrenaline. The first shot cracked through the night, followed by another. The crossroads turned into chaos. Muzzle flashes lit the darkness like lightning. Cole shouted orders, voice hoarse. Miller fired until his shoulders ached. The sound of bullets hitting mud, men screaming, shells whistling overhead. It all blended into one long nightmare. Hours passed like seconds. When the gunfire finally faded, the snow was red again. Bodies lay scattered across the field, some friend, some foe. Smoke drifted low, clinging to the ground like a ghost that refused to rise. Miller stumbled through the wreckage, half deaf, his rifle empty. Cole was alive, barely, a deep gash running down his arm. They patched up the wounded, gathered the dead, and waited for dawn. When the light came, it was thin and cold. The world looked drained of color, as if even nature was tired of watching. An officer arrived that afternoon, a man named Captain Reeves. Clean uniform, sharp eyes, the kind of man who still believed in structure. You held the line, Reeves said. Command's impressed. Cole gave a bitter laugh. Impressed doesn't bring back the dead. Reeves ignored the comment. You'll be reassigned again soon. There's a push coming, big one. The end's near. Miller looked at him, unsure whether to believe that or fear it. The end was something everyone kept talking about, but no one knew what it meant anymore. That night, Reeves sat by their fire telling stories of Washington, of the promise of victory, of medals and parades. The men listened, half out of habit, half because they needed something, anything to hold on to. When Reeves finished, Miller stared into the flames. "What do you think happens when it's all over?" he asked. Reeves smiled faintly. "We go home. We rebuild. Simple as that." Cole shook his head. "It's never that simple." The silence that followed said more than any speech ever could. Days later, the new orders arrived. The unit was to advance into a valley rumored to hold enemy supply lines. Intelligence was thin, weather worse, morale non-existent. They went anyway. Because that's what soldiers do. The valley was a graveyard of trees and frozen rivers. Fog hung so thick they could barely see 10 feet ahead. Every sound felt amplified. The crunch of boots, the click of a safety, the slow, rhythmic breath of men trying not to panic. Halfway through the valley, the ambush hit. Machine guns opened from the ridge. Men dropped instantly. Shouts echoed, orders got lost in the chaos. Miller dove behind a rock, firing blindly. Reeves was hit first. Cole dragged him to cover, but it was too late. The captain's last words were barely a whisper. "Keep moving." They did. Crawling through mud, slipping between trees, firing when they could, running when they had to. By the time it was over, the valley was silent again. The survivors, what few were left, looked less like men and more like shadows. Miller sat beside Reeves's body for a long time after the shooting stopped. The man's notebook lay open beside him. Inside, neat handwriting listed coordinates, supplies, and a final line. "If anyone finds this, tell my wife I did my duty." Miller closed the book and placed it beside the captain's chest. Then he stood up and looked at the horizon. The war was still raging somewhere beyond that fog. But here, in this quiet stretch of death and snow, it already felt over. The men buried Reeves at the base of an old oak. No ceremony, no flag, just a moment of silence and the sound of wind through branches. As they prepared to move again, Cole looked at Miller. "You think we'll ever be normal again?" Miller didn't answer right away. "Maybe," he said at last, "but I don't think normal's waiting for us. We'll have to make it ourselves." They walked on. The fog swallowed them and the world behind disappeared. Later that night, they camped by the edge of a frozen river. The stars were faint, blurred by clouds. Miller took out the wooden horse again, running his thumb over it like a prayer bead. He thought of the letter to Evelyn, of Reeves's notebook, of the boy in the ruins who'd given him the toy. Somewhere in the distance, gunfire echoed. But it sounded far away now, like thunder on the other side of the world. Cole broke the silence. "You ever wonder what we'll tell them? The ones back home?" Miller stared at the flames. "I think we'll tell them what they want to hear. And keep the truth for ourselves." Cole nodded slowly. "Yeah, the truth's too heavy for people who've never carried it." Neither man slept that night. They just sat there, waiting for dawn that felt like it might never come. When it finally did, it came softly, gray light over white ground, a new day that looked exactly like the last. They rose, packed their gear, and started walking again. Because in the end, that's all they knew how to do. The war wasn't finished. But something inside them was. Days blurred again. The snow melted into mud, the mud dried into dust, and the seasons began to change, though no one seemed to notice. By spring, Miller's unit was unrecognizable. The faces were new, the laughter was quieter, the rations thinner. They had become a kind of wandering tribe, moving wherever the maps and the voices on the radio told them to. One morning, they reached the outskirts of a village that had been fought over so many times it no longer had a name. The church stood half collapsed. The bell rusted, the air thick with the smell of smoke and rot. Inside, they found civilians, old men, women, children, silent, hollow-eyed. Miller offered a can of beans to a boy no older than 10. The boy took it without a word, and when their eyes met, Miller saw the same haunted look he'd seen in the mirror that morning. War didn't care about uniforms. It turned everyone into the same thing. Cole was quieter now. The wound on his arm had healed into a dark scar, but the light in his eyes hadn't returned. He carried a small notebook of his own, scribbling things down between marches. When Miller asked what he was writing, Cole only said, "Something to remember who we were before this." One evening, as they camped near the river, Cole began to read from it. Not orders, not coordinates, just fragments of memory. First snow in Pennsylvania? Smell of my mother's kitchen. The sound of my brother's laugh before he enlisted. The men listened in silence. Some smiled, others turned away. When he stopped reading, the silence felt sacred, like they'd touched something human again, if only for a second. The next operation came without warning. When the battle ended, there was nothing left of the unit. Only Miller and a handful of strangers pulled together by luck and stubbornness. They retreated into the forest, hiding from both sides, unsure which direction home was anymore. Weeks later, they stumbled into an Allied convoy. A major recognized Miller's insignia, ordered him onto a truck, and sent him back to headquarters. The war was ending, the man said. You're going home. Home. The word felt foreign now. Back in France, Miller stood in line to turn in his weapon. The officer behind the desk stamped his papers without looking up. Congratulations, Sergeant. You survived. Miller didn't answer. He boarded the transport ship with hundreds of others. Some laughed, some cried, some stared at the ocean without blinking. When America appeared on the horizon, cheers broke out. Miller felt nothing. The harbor smelled of oil and salt and freedom. Reporters waited with cameras, families waved flags. A brass band played. But the men who stepped off that ship looked nothing like heroes. They looked like ghosts in borrowed skin. Miller rented a small apartment in Chicago near the rail yard. He got a job unloading freight. Every night he'd take out the notebook and the wooden horse, setting them side by side on the table. He'd read Cole's words, traced the grain of the toy, and listened to the hum of the city outside. The noise was different now. No gunfire, no bombs. But his body still tensed at every loud sound. The war hadn't followed him home. It had never left. Years passed. The medals gathered dust in a drawer. The letters stopped coming. Miller grew older, quieter, learning how to live among people who didn't understand what silence really meant. Sometimes he'd walk to the lake and watch the reflection of the skyline tremble on the water. He'd think about the faces he couldn't remember anymore, the ones he'd promised never to forget. And he'd whisper, "We did come home, just not the same." One winter evening, a knock came at his door. It was a young reporter, barely 20. "Sir," she said, "we're interviewing veterans for the paper. Could you tell me what it was like?" Miller studied her face, bright, innocent, untouched by war. He smiled faintly. "No," he said softly. "You wouldn't believe me if I did." The reporter hesitated, then asked, "Then what should people remember?" Miller looked at the wooden horse on the table. The edges were worn smooth now, the paint long faded. He said, "That peace isn't the absence of war. It's the memory of those who carried it." The girl wrote something down, thanked him, and left. Miller sat there long after the door closed, the city humming outside like a distant battlefield. He reached for Cole's notebook one last time. On the final page was a single sentence he'd never noticed before. "We'll be forgotten by the world, but not by the earth we fought on." Miller smiled. Then he closed the book and set it beside the horse. Outside, snow began to fall, soft, quiet, endless. He stood by the window and watched it cover the streets, the rooftops, the lights. Each flake fell like a ghost finding rest at last. And for the first time in years, Miller felt something close to peace.